A strong and unexpected statement came from the office of South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa. In that statement, he made something very clear: he wanted President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria to release Nnamdi Kanu. The message was direct, calm, but powerful. It was not filled with fancy diplomatic words or hidden meanings. It was plain and straight to the point. Ramaphosa said that justice must be respected, and that Nigeria must obey its own court orders regarding Kanu's case. That one message spread across Africa and beyond within hours. It shocked many political observers because it came from a sitting African president who chose to speak openly about a matter that most leaders had quietly avoided. Nnamdi Kanu's detention has always been a controversial topic, one that has divided opinion across Nigeria and drawn attention from international organizations. But what Ramaphosa said was different. It came from a place of moral authority and deep understanding of justice. Ramaphosa is not the kind of leader who speaks without careful thought. When he finally chose to speak about the issue, it meant he had watched the situation long enough and believed it was time to intervene. His statement was not meant to embarrass Nigeria. It was meant to remind Africa's largest democracy that leadership comes with responsibility, and that responsibility includes respecting the rule of law. In his message, Ramaphosa spoke firmly about the importance of justice and equality. He reminded Nigeria that no country grows stronger by ignoring court judgments or by silencing voices that demand fairness. He said Africa cannot move forward if its leaders do not treat their citizens with respect and dignity. According to him, Nigeria has always been seen as a symbol of strength and leadership in Africa, and that means it must set the right example for the continent to follow. Diplomatic sources later confirmed that the South African presidency had been observing the Nnamdi Kanu case for months. They had seen the court rulings that ordered Kanu's release, and they were aware that those rulings were not followed. For Ramaphosa, that was a serious concern. He believed that if Africa wants to be taken seriously in the global community, it must first show that it can handle its internal issues with fairness and justice. After the statement was released, it dominated headlines across African news outlets. The words "Ramaphosa calls on Tinubu to release Nnamdi Kanu" appeared in almost every major media platform on the continent. Political commentators described it as one of the boldest and most respectful diplomatic interventions in recent years. Ramaphosa did not attack or insult anyone. He simply called for what is right, justice and obedience to the rule of law. Inside Nigeria, the statement quickly became a talking point among lawmakers and government officials. Many of them were caught off guard. For the first time, another African leader was publicly calling on Nigeria to act on an issue that had been dragging for years. Reports suggested that top aides in Aso Rock met quietly to discuss how to respond. Some believed the presidency should ignore the statement to avoid giving it more attention. Others argued that silence would only make Nigeria appear defensive. But no matter the reaction, the message had already landed. People across Africa began to talk about it. In Kenya, Ghana, and even in the diaspora communities in Europe and America, Africans were discussing how rare it was for one African president to openly call another to order on matters of human rights. Many said Ramaphosa had done what others were too afraid to do, to speak truth to power, calmly and with respect. Observers also noted that Ramaphosa's statement carried emotional weight because of his own background. He is a man who fought for freedom during South Africa's struggle against apartheid. He knows what it means to be detained for standing up for what you believe in. That history gave his words extra force. When he said that justice must be respected, it was not just political talk, it came from real experience. The Nigerian government, on the other hand, tried to downplay the statement. But behind the scenes, it created unease. Officials knew that when a leader of Ramaphosa's level speaks on such a matter, the world listens. It was not just a South African issue anymore, it had become an African issue. Political analysts described the move as a wake-up call to Tinubu's administration. They said Ramaphosa had spoken the mind of many who had remained silent. The message was not an attack, it was a challenge, a call for Nigeria to show leadership, fairness, and respect for its own judicial system. Even outside the political space, people began to reflect. Ordinary citizens across the continent saw Ramaphosa's call as a symbol of courage. For them, it was not about politics, but about the principle that no leader should be above the law, and no citizen should be held unlawfully. The statement was simple, yet it carried the power of truth. It cut across tribal, political, and national lines. It reminded Africans that leadership is not about fear or silence, it is about standing for what is right, even when it is not convenient. Ramaphosa's message changed the tone of the conversation around Nnamdi Kanu's detention. It was no longer just a domestic Nigerian issue. It had now become a matter of continental concern. For the first time, it felt like Africa was speaking to itself, one leader urging another to uphold the values they all claim to defend. The message was clear and deeply realistic: justice delayed is justice denied. Ramaphosa's words stood not just as a diplomatic statement, but as a moral reminder that true strength lies in doing what is right, not in showing power. And from that moment, the silence surrounding the Nnamdi Kanu case began to crack. The pressure had shifted, not from the streets, not from activists, but from the seat of another president who believed that justice is the foundation of true African unity. Cyril Ramaphosa's decision to speak about Nnamdi Kanu did not happen by accident. It was the result of long observation, quiet discussions, and a growing sense that silence was no longer acceptable. For months, South Africa had been watching how the case was unfolding in Nigeria. Each time a court ruled that Kanu should be released, and the order was ignored, it raised questions within diplomatic circles. At first, Ramaphosa kept his distance. He believed it was a matter for Nigeria to handle. But as the situation dragged on, it began to represent something much larger than just one man's detention. It became a symbol of how Africa deals with justice and leadership. Ramaphosa is known across Africa as a calm and measured leader. He does not speak carelessly, and when he finally chooses to say something, it usually carries meaning. Those close to him say that the Nnamdi Kanu issue began to trouble him deeply, especially after reading several international reports that described Nigeria's handling of the matter as unfair. He believed that if a country like Nigeria, with all its influence and democratic pride, could ignore its own court rulings, it would send the wrong signal to the entire continent. He also knew that many African leaders had chosen to stay quiet because they feared political tension or diplomatic backlash. But to him, silence was not leadership. He believed that Africa could never grow if its leaders only spoke when it was convenient. According to sources within his administration, Ramaphosa's statement was not about taking sides, it was about defending the principle of justice, a principle he had lived by all his life. Those who understand his political background know that Ramaphosa's entire career has been shaped by the fight for fairness. As a young activist in South Africa's anti-apartheid movement, he experienced what it meant to be detained, threatened, and silenced for demanding change. He never forgot those days. So when he saw a fellow African being detained in defiance of court orders, he saw more than just politics, he saw history repeating itself. Before releasing his statement, he reportedly held several internal meetings with his foreign affairs advisors. They discussed the diplomatic weight of his words, the possible reaction from Nigeria, and the message it would send to the rest of the world. In the end, he concluded that silence would make South Africa appear weak and indifferent to justice. So he decided to act. In his message, he spoke about how Africa cannot demand respect from the world if it does not respect its own people. He reminded everyone that the struggle for independence across Africa was built on the foundation of justice, and that any government that ignores the law betrays that history. His words were strong but carefully chosen. They were diplomatic, yet clear enough to be understood without confusion. He also drew attention to the growing frustration among Africans who feel that their leaders only act under pressure from foreign countries. Ramaphosa made it clear that Africa must learn to solve its own problems internally. He said that the call for Kanu's release was not just about Nigeria, it was about restoring confidence in African leadership and showing that the continent can stand for fairness without outside interference. Within hours of his statement, several human rights groups praised his courage. They said his message represented a new kind of African diplomacy, one that prioritizes justice over politics. Even in South Africa's parliament, some lawmakers stood up to commend the president for showing leadership that aligns with the country's long history of fighting for equality. Across Africa, people began to interpret Ramaphosa's move in different ways. Some saw it as an act of solidarity with Nnamdi Kanu. Others viewed it as a warning to all African leaders that no one is above the law. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: his words carried honesty. They were not the typical empty diplomatic talk that people had grown used to. In Nigeria, the reaction was mixed. Government officials tried to play it down, but many Nigerians saw it as a bold and timely message. Social commentators said that Ramaphosa had done what many had hoped other leaders would do, to speak up, not out of pity, but out of principle. Some even argued that his call was a form of quiet diplomacy aimed at protecting Nigeria's image before it worsened further. African analysts later pointed out that Ramaphosa's statement also came at a time when the African Union was trying to promote a new era of accountability among its member states. For years, the Union had been criticized for doing little when leaders violated human rights or ignored court rulings. Ramaphosa's move was seen as a signal that things might finally be changing, that Africa could now begin to hold itself accountable from within. His message also carried a hidden lesson. It showed that being a strong nation is not about how many soldiers or resources a country has, but about how much respect it gives to its laws. By calling on Nigeria to release Kanu, Ramaphosa was indirectly saying that the true power of leadership lies in fairness, not in force. Political observers in Johannesburg noted that his statement was carefully timed. South Africa had just hosted a regional summit on peace and governance, where leaders discussed how to strengthen democracy in Africa. Many believe that after those discussions, Ramaphosa felt the time was right to take a moral stand. His words, though directed at Nigeria, were meant for every African leader who might one day face a similar test. He ended his message by stressing that every African deserves a fair hearing, regardless of their tribe, background, or political view. That sentence struck deeply across the continent because it touched on the painful truth that many governments still struggle to treat their citizens equally. In the end, Ramaphosa's decision to speak out was not about politics or popularity. It was about restoring dignity to the African leadership space. He knew that by speaking, he risked creating diplomatic tension, but he also knew that history remembers those who stand for justice, not those who hide behind silence. His words were not loud, but they were firm. They reminded Africa that leadership is not about protecting power, it is about protecting truth. And that truth, according to Ramaphosa, is simple: justice must never depend on who you are or where you come from. Justice must stand, even when it is inconvenient. The statement from President Cyril Ramaphosa had been released, and it spread across the continent like a quiet storm. There was no build-up, no special announcement, it simply appeared and immediately became a topic of deep attention. It wasn't forced or planned to create drama. It just happened. One leader spoke from conviction, and that alone changed the tone of an issue that had long been treated like a closed conversation. Inside government circles across Africa, there was a new kind of silence, the kind that comes when words carry weight. Ramaphosa's call for justice was clear and unshakable, and it had already been heard in Abuja. Whether or not Nigeria would respond was another matter. But one thing was certain: things were no longer the same. Once a president speaks on a matter like this, even quietly, the ground begins to shift. For many observers, this was one of those moments in African politics when things either begin to move forward or freeze completely. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would President Tinubu choose to address the statement? Would his government take a second look at Kanu's case? No one could tell. But it was clear that the pressure had subtly increased, not through protests or foreign demands, but through the calm, deliberate words of another African leader who believed in doing what was right. Behind closed doors, Nigeria's presidency was said to be reassessing the matter carefully. Officials understood that Ramaphosa's message wasn't one that could easily be brushed aside. This was not a random opinion or social commentary, it came from a sitting head of state, and it came with moral authority. Even if no official statement was made in response, the impact had already registered where it mattered most. For the first time in a long while, the Nnamdi Kanu case had returned to the center of international attention, not because of outside influence, but because of a simple call from within Africa itself. That changed everything. It showed that African leaders were beginning to look inward, to hold each other to a higher standard, and to remind one another that true leadership means standing for justice even when it is uncomfortable. Ramaphosa's action had also quietly tested the unity of African diplomacy. There is an unwritten rule among leaders on the continent not to openly speak on another country's internal issues. But this time, that rule was broken, and it was broken for a reason that carried meaning. Ramaphosa had not insulted Nigeria, he had not interfered in its sovereignty. He had simply appealed to conscience, to principle, to the very values that every African constitution claims to uphold. As the days went by, his statement remained in focus. It was quoted in international discussions about African leadership and the need for accountability. It was studied in diplomatic circles and mentioned in policy briefings. People began to see that this was not just about one man or one case, it was about how justice functions on the continent. If Ramaphosa's goal was to start a reflection, then he succeeded. In every quiet corner of African politics, his statement forced a question that could not be ignored: what does justice mean if we choose when to obey it? That question, simple but powerful, lingered in the background of every decision, every meeting, every discussion related to the Kanu issue. The truth was that Africa had reached a point where silence could no longer protect anyone. When one leader speaks truth, others must listen, even if they do not respond. Ramaphosa's statement was not designed to shame, it was meant to awaken. He wanted Nigeria, and by extension, every African nation, to remember that leadership is not measured by control, but by fairness. Even without public debate, the tone inside African diplomacy had changed. Governments that had remained quiet before began quietly reviewing their own policies on political cases. Not because they wanted attention, but because Ramaphosa's statement reminded them that the world was watching how African nations treat their citizens. His words had become a mirror that reflected the state of justice on the continent. For Nigeria, this was a delicate moment. The administration faced a choice: to see Ramaphosa's call as interference, or to see it as an opportunity to correct what many already considered a prolonged injustice. The decision would not be made overnight, but it was clear that things could not stay the same. Let's watch and see if the Ramaphosa statement will change anything. That was the general feeling among many who followed the story closely. Would Nigeria finally take a bold step toward closure, or would it continue to hold its ground in silence? Nobody could predict the next move. But one thing was undeniable: the conversation had shifted from the streets to the level of presidents. And once it gets there, silence is never permanent. If anything, Ramaphosa's move had shown that there is still space for moral leadership in Africa. It showed that it is possible for one leader to call another to order without creating hostility, that it is possible to speak the truth without turning it into conflict. His calm and balanced tone gave weight to the idea that Africa can correct itself from within, that it doesn't always need outsiders to remind it of what is right. As the dust settled, the entire episode began to feel like the opening of a new chapter in African diplomacy. One where justice is not just spoken about, but expected. One where silence is no longer a shield for wrong decisions. One where leaders begin to understand that justice delayed is not only justice denied, it is also leadership diminished. The world continues to watch Nigeria. The courts have spoken. Now, the moral voice from Pretoria has joined that call. The decision rests entirely with Tinubu's government to either prove that Nigeria still stands as the pillar of African democracy or to allow this silence to stretch even further. Ramaphosa's action may not immediately free Nnamdi Kanu, but it has done something equally powerful: it has changed the perception of what is acceptable. It has made justice part of the African political conversation again. It has reminded everyone that fairness is not a weakness, and that leadership without justice is empty. For now, the continent waits. No speeches, no drama, just quiet expectation. The kind that carries truth in it. Because in the end, actions will speak louder than any statement. And history will record who stood for justice when it truly mattered.